Do you know that the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals estimates that over 920,000 shelter animals are euthanized each year in the US? While this number has progressively decreased over time, it highlights a common issue many shelters struggle with not just in the US but around the globe. While a worrisome statistic, there is hope through the use of data analysis to improve shelter operations, as well as assist decision makers using evidence which improves the chance of successful outcomes using their limited resources. Within this presentation, I endeavor to open your eyes to the positive impact data analysis brings towards helping our furry friends. Our presentation has the goals to show how data can guide and change behavior within a shelter using a real-world example. It also endeavors to highlight benefits of using data analysis. So why should we care? Many of us who have pets only want the best for them. That's because animals deserve to be treated with care to achieve a state of well-being which essentially meets their 5 freedoms. Those being freedom from hunger and thirst, freedom from discomfort, freedom from pain, injury, or disease, freedom to express normal behavior, and the freedom from fear and distress. In addition, shelters and rescues are facing overcrowding, which impacts animal well-being, or essentially capacity for care at the shelter. I'll discuss this a bit more in the next slide. Here, we can see a recent release from the City of Boston's Animal Center, which it states is at critical capacity. So our analysis within this presentation will take a look at the data taken from the Austin Animal Center. So let's take a look at the typical challenges to achieving capacity for care in a shelter. Capacity for care essentially means that the needs of every animal in a shelter are met to provide those 5 freedoms we previously mentioned. Therefore, animals in the shelters that operate within their capacity for care stay in humane housing that supports good health and welfare, receive appropriate medical care, and move toward their best possible outcome without delays. The workflow shown here endeavors to highlight the challenges that the shelter may face, such as unclear decision making or obstructions animal flow through within the shelter. Now these lead to increased length of stay, which increases the risk of overwhelmed staff or infectious disease outbreaks at the shelter, leading to the poor welfare of the animals. Now, increased length of stay can have a negative impact, such as euthanasia for space in the shelter, thereby decreasing the life-saving capacity at the shelter. So, within the data analysis given, we'll be hoping to investigate length of stay, and thereby eventually justifying the benefits that data analysis can bring to decreasing the risks highlighted within the slide. There are several key aspects that we need to discuss before proceeding within the presentation that can affect with our analysis. It's important to know that we perform an exploratory data analysis at the population level within the shelter, with the goal of identifying patterns in animal intakes and outcomes and assessing the efficiency of the operation at the shelter. Also, the data is for approximately 10-year span between 2013 and 2024, and it includes a mix of intake types, outcomes, and animal demographics at the shelter. Within our presentation, I'll be looking at several key metrics or KPIs that are typically used to assess the performance at the shelter, such as the intake and outcome data, average length of stay, the receive rate at the shelter, adoption rates, and the housing capacity. A point to consider is in understanding the terminology used within a shelter. For example, when I refer to intakes, I'm referring to the status of animals as they arrive at a shelter. Also, when I say outcome, I'm referring to status as they leave. Another important point is that the data used within this presentation is from the Austin, Texas Animal Center. Therefore, the insights mentioned would only pertain to that shelter's performance. However, the analysis and insights gained can also apply to similar shelters, regardless of the size and location. It's important to also understand and appreciate the analysis limitations and constraints. when dealing with data, there are always going to be issues within the raw data that need to be addressed and assumptions need to be made. So, for example, new links between demographic data, human population, external factors to intakes or outcomes can be assessed, as there are new research to back that assessment. Shelter data is influenced by a complex mix of internal policies such as managed intake and outcome protocols, and external factors such as economic and population changes. This complexity can affect the interpretation of data trends and findings, so that needs to be considered. While the EDA analysis might reveal interesting associations, these should not be interpreted as cause and effect relationships without further study. When I refer to EDA, I'm referring to the exploratory data analysis I previously mentioned. The previously mentioned limitations and constraints can be further investigated at the Shelter Animals Council database website. Before proceeding into our analysis, we want to take a closer look at the important stakeholders within the ecosystem surrounding a typical shelter. These stakeholders can be placed into four main categories, such as care and welfare, community and education, regulatory and oversight, and support and resources. Within this illustration, I hope to highlight the key metrics or KPIs the respective categories or stakeholders are required to have. For example, under the care and welfare, we have sub-stakeholders as staff or veterinarians, or EWOs and rescues. Under community and education, we have the public, educational institutions, and the media. Regulatory and oversight often contain government agencies, law enforcement associations, or Association of Shelter Veterinarians, or ESP. Support and resources often contains donors or volunteers, or the local community businesses. As I mentioned, each stakeholder would have a need for a particular KPI that's important for them to fulfill their duty within the ecosystem. Within our presentation, we'll be looking at several of these KPIs, such as the adoption rate, save rate, length of stay at the shelter, and even looking at the shelter capacity.
So let's get started with our analysis. We'll begin with some summary statistics. 158,000 animals were admitted to the shelter between 2013 and 2024. Of those, 142,000 were unique animals that entered the shelter, and of those, approximately 9% of those unique animals had multiple visits to the shelter. 94% of intakes are either dogs or cats, with dogs making up approximately 55% of that 94%. And approximately 20 days made up the overall average length of stay at the shelter for all animals. So we begin our analysis by looking at the question, where are the intakes coming from? And you can see from this slide that most animals are coming from Austin and Travis County, which makes sense because the Austin Animal Center is a municipal shelter for the city of Austin and the unincorporated Travis County. While there are other cities and counties that have input towards the shelter, Austin and Travis County account for the majority of those animals that come in. So who's entering the shelter? Essentially, strays, owner surrender, public assist, and wildlife account for the majority of the animals that enter the shelter. What are the dominant intake types in the top three locations? As mentioned before, Austin and Travis County account for the majority of the animals that come into the shelter. With Austin, you can see it has high proportions across all intake types, whether it be abandoned, stray, euthanasia request, public assist, etc. Travis County, however, has a problem with stray animals, followed by owner surrender. So we'll be looking into this a bit more as we proceed into our analysis. Given Austin makes up a significant proportion of animals in the shelter, we'll focus here, as shown by my little furry friend. What animal is entering the shelter? Well, A significant proportion of the animals that come into shelter are dogs or puppies, followed by cats or kittens. Further analysis shows that dogs and cats make up the majority of the intakes classified as strays, owner surrender, abandon, and public assist. Other animals make up the wildlife classification. The bar chart shows that dogs make up the largest proportion within each intake category. Most animals brought in by the public under the public assist category is significantly dominated by dogs. Therefore, going forward, my analysis will primarily focus on dogs and cats. What are the outcomes for the animals? Shown here on the top graph, live release makes up a significant proportion at 92.2%, followed by non-live at 7.7%. The lower graph shows the breakdown of the outcome types. And you can see adoption, transfer, and return to owner make up significant proportions, followed by euthanasia at 6.3%. Every other outcome type is significantly lower than 3%, which is good, showing that this live release is made up of adoption, transfer, and return to owner proportion. What animal type has repeat visits to the shelter? It's clearly seen that dogs and puppies make up a significant proportion over cats and kittens that revisit the shelter. So let's pause for thoughts. What actions can we take given the findings from our analysis thus far? Well, we can perform further analysis with a focus on Austin, since it accounts for the largest proportion of animals entering the shelter. Efforts here will have significant effects. Our aim here is for the analysis showing a high number of animals coming from specific areas or under certain conditions could guide shelters to work on targeted community engagement and education initiatives. By addressing issues like spaying and neutering, proper pet care, and the responsibilities of pet ownership at a community level, shelters can potentially reduce the number of intakes and improve animal welfare in the long term. We will also want to ask several additional questions, such as what factors are influencing the number of dogs being brought in by the public as well as those with euthanasia requests. Also, what services can the shelter provide to alleviate the challenges dog owners are experiencing to reduce the abandon and stray proportions? What are the factors that affect the low proportion of cats brought in by the public? Maybe effective strategies applied in a city can be applied somewhere else. And what factors are influencing the number of dogs returning to the shelter? In continuing with our analysis, we asked, what is the average time in the shelter by animal type? As you can see here, between 2013 and February of 2024, livestock animals spent the longest average time in the shelter with approximately 132 days. This was followed by cats with 23 days, dogs with 20 days, birds with 9 days, and lastly other animals within 5 days. Now this gives us an idea of the relative average time of the animal given the overall average that we determined earlier at 20 days. So we can see cats and dogs are around the overall average and livestock being significantly higher. And there are other factors that may influence that, but our analysis is going to focus on cats and dogs going forward. So next we asked, what is the average time in a shelter for cats and dogs by their age? Cats generally have higher average stays than dogs across all age groups, as you can see here by the bar chart to the right. For cats, the longest period of stay are between the ages of 3 to 16 years. And their overall mean length of stay was approximately 23 days. While for dogs, it's between the ages of 2 and 11 years old, which are above the overall length, roughly around 20 days at the shelter. It's important to identify that for cats, or kittens in this particular case, the value of the average stay is above the overall average of 20 days. So that's worth investigating further in our analysis, or at a later date. Next we ask, do dogs get adopted faster than cats? The line graph gives us an appreciation as to the probability of not being adopted as the days in shelter increases. So let's look at the red line, which represents the dogs, and you can see it starts off at 1, being the highest probability of dog not being adopted, given it's just entered the shelter, and as it spends time in the shelter, that probability drops off, which represents the probability of the dog eventually being adopted later on in the shelter stay. The blue line represents that of the cat. So, in interpreting this data, we can see that dogs have a better probability of being adopted within the first 35 days within the shelter. This is an interesting finding that's worthy of future further analysis. So, what are the most adopted dog breeds? Here we can clearly see the top 5 dog breeds that are adopted at the shelter, with 4 of those being German Shepherd types. So, it appears that the larger breed dogs are the ones that adopted the fastest. So next we ask, what are the least adopted dog breeds? You can clearly see that the smaller dog breeds are the least adopted, such as the Greyhound or Cocker Spaniel, even the Poodle. It gives us some insight into where we can focus our efforts going forward in adoption programs or campaigns. So this is a great time to pause for thoughts. And again, what actions or questions can we take or ask going forward? We can ask, why are kittens likely to spend more time at a shelter than puppies? Or what factors or strategies influence the adoption of dogs over cats within that first 35 days at a shelter? Maybe we can adopt similar strategies to cats. Are adoption rates of dogs greater than cats across all cities? Note, we will need additional data on location of the doctors to perform this analysis. Do specific shelters prioritize the promotion of adopting medium and large breed dogs? If so, is it working in reducing the dog population within a shelter to reduce overcrowding? Maybe focus on marketing strategy to promote the adoption of the smaller breed dogs instead. Over the next few slides, we'll be looking at metrics associated with the performance of the shelter. So we ask the question, what month has the most intakes and outcomes? Over the 10-year span of our analysis, May has the most intakes, while July has the most outcomes or outflows. However, we also observe a period between June to August with a relatively close number of outcomes, and this represents a summer period of the year. So we can see that within that June, July, August time frame, there are significantly more outcomes. Next, we ask what day has the most intakes and outcomes. Over that 10-year span again, the most intakes occurred at the start of the week and then declined steadily. There appears to be slight uptake in the number of intakes on a Friday, possibly due to those wanting to get in before the weekend. In terms of outcomes, Tuesdays and Saturdays show the highest count. Outcomes being higher on a Saturday was experienced since most people would wait till the end of the week before visiting the shelter. However, the number on Tuesdays definitely warrants further investigation. So we dig a bit deeper and ask the question, what animal outcome is driving Tuesdays being the busiest day of the week? Looking at the bar chart to the right, which represents Saturdays and the outcomes for that particular day, Saturdays have the highest proportion of adoptions as compared to Tuesdays. However, on Tuesdays, which is represented by the bar chart on the right, has a higher return to owner and transfer percentage. So next we ask what time of day has the most intakes. The shelters are busiest from Monday to Friday between 11 a.m. to 7 p.m. This represented by the sections in the blue color on our heat map, which is used via a color spectrum to represent the number of intakes across all of the shelter. On the weekend, however, they are busiest around 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. So what factors might influence recent adoption rates in the year of 2023? So we're digging a bit deeper and narrowing our focus to the last year of our data set. Here we can clearly see the adoption rate steadily decreases in the first few months of the year and then increases towards the end of the year. And there's an inverse relationship with that of the transfer rate within the shelter. So it appears as adoption rate declines, the shelter attempts to transfer animals out of it and thereby increase spacing and possibly increase capacity for care. You can see that the euthanasia rate, which is represented by the grey line, doesn't increase or decrease significantly within the year, which is pretty good. So the shelter is doing a very good job in terms of keeping euthanasia rate under control. However, there is no movement in the relocation line or relocation rate within the year. This can be further investigated or we can troubleshoot this a bit more in the future. So is the Austin Animal Center a no-kill shelter? This is an important KPI for the city of Austin. And no-kill as a philosophical principle means saving every dog or cat in a shelter who can be saved. The national standard for a shelter meeting the no-kill requirement is 90%. Therefore, the Austin Animal Center is classified as a no-kill shelter because, as you can see here from the line graph, it constantly maintains a save rate over the last 10 years above that 90% save rate benchmark set by the city. However, based on the Austin Animal Center's website in 2019, the Austin City Council has mandated that shelters achieve a live release or save rate of 95%, so there is some work that can be done. Another important metric, often measured within a shelter, is the housing capacity. So we ask the question, what is the housing capacity for medium and large breed dogs in 2023? Now for the Austin Animal Center, there is a capacity threshold of 270 species, but as you can clearly see, at the beginning of 2023, that number is far surpassed and hasn't been able to drop below that threshold limit. So the earlier surge that surpassed the capacity threshold may indicate a seasonal increase in intakes, which could include higher number of strays or owner surrenders after the winter season, thereby resulting in that sharp increase at the beginning of the year. The stabilization by me suggests that while intakes might have decreased or leveled off, they were still sufficient to keep the shelter at or above capacity for dogs. So, sadly, there are a lot of dogs that are not getting into the shelter. So further investigation led us to ask the question, why are the number of dogs in 2023 not decreasing? The line graph here represents the weekly rate of change of the number of dogs in the green line as compared to the weekly adoption rate, which is the purple line. You can clearly see that while there is significant movement in the weekly rate of change of the number of dogs at the shelter, the adoption rate remains relatively unchanged. So, this high variance in the weekly rate of change in the number of dogs being taken into the shelter is outpacing the rate at which dogs leave. The adoption rate is not sufficient to reduce the number of dogs in the shelter. Another perspective that we consider is how has the shelter performed in the last few years after COVID-19. Cohort analysis shows us the movement of particular cohorts of animals through the shelter on a monthly basis. You can see that within the second period, within the last 2 years, the overall average proportion of animals per cohort was approximately 55%. So there are periods where the cohort remained above 55%, and that's represented by the darker blue cells that you see here. Now, there are also cohorts that took longer to move through the shelter generally, beyond a 4-month period. Now, those are worth further investigation in the future, so this is just another perspective that a possible shelter can look at to improve its overall performance. So now, final pause for thoughts. What actions can we take? What questions can we ask for further analysis in the future? Is there a season that influences the number of intakes or outcomes? Focus on a promotion to increase the adoption rate in the first 6 months of the year. For example, during periods of high intake but low adoption rates, a focused campaign could help prevent overcrowding and reduce stress on resources. This approach would be especially effective during times identified as peak intake periods. Possibly increase shelter staff or volunteers during that time to facilitate the quick transfer of animals to reduce housing capacity burdens. Shelters should focus more on building relationships or coordination with other rescue centers or foster care homes to reduce the housing capacity of medium and large breed dogs. Finally, focus further analysis on data that highlights the impact of health and behavioral conditions on the length of stay and adoption probabilities of the animal. The expectation here is by utilizing data that highlights the impact of health and behavioral conditions, shelters can invest in programs aimed at improving the health and behavior of animals in their care. This could include partnerships with veterinarians for health checks and vaccinations, as well as professional trainers for behavioral modification programs. Such initiatives could improve adoption rates for animals that might otherwise be overlooked due to health or behavioral issues. How can data unlock the secrets to saving more lives at a shelter? We can create a dashboard to track KPIs to improve shelter performance or sustainability and reputation of the shelter. We can also revisit those KPIs after promotions or campaigns to verify their effectiveness. We can create a model to predict the length of stay to animals based on their intake types and conditions, and that allows resources to be efficiently used. We can use data analysis to better predict which animals are more likely to find new homes based on their background, health, and breed. So these are just a few opportunities for using data analysis within your animal shelter. So as my friend shows here, the future is bright using our data. While we cannot predict the future with any great accuracy, there is uncertainty always in analysis, but there are opportunities, and if properly done, they can bring value within the shelter. In closing, I want to express a heartfelt gratitude to all animal organizations and welfare organizations that are making the effort to help those in need and the innocent little lives that need us the most. I'm Andy from Purpose Project Services Limited, and I hope this presentation enlightened you on the potential benefits that data analysis can bring to the table within an animal shelter. Feel free to reach out to me via any of our social media platforms shown here. Feel free to follow my page. Also, contact me via email if you'd like some further information on how I can help.